In prior videos, we've talked about the greatest performers of WWE across its various eras, but of course, WWE isn't the only promotion out there. No, there are several other wrestling companies currently active in North America alone, and of those companies, one of the greatest and longest running has been TNA. But who are the greatest wrestlers to grace the Impact Zone? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now. And where better to start than with arguably the greatest of all time, AJ Styles. Yes, before he was a two-time WWE champion. Hell, before he was even a two-time IWGP heavyweight champion, AJ Styles was one of the pillars of total non-stop action. And the way he became such a pillar of the company was by acting as one of their top homegrown talents from day one. Seriously, after making his first appearance at the promotion's debut show in May of 2002 to team up with Low-Ki and Jerry Lynn in their battle against the Flying Elvises, the Phenomenal One would become a staple of the Impact Zone going forward. And this was a major feather in the cap of the fledgling brand then, because in the North Carolinian, they had quite simply one of the best wrestlers of his generation. Would all this talent translate towards success in TNA for AJ though? Well, in a word, yes. Because despite being a relatively small guy, his in-ring work was so spectacular that the company were given no choice but to make him their world champion on no less than 5 occasions. And when they weren't doing that, they were having him serve as the centerpiece of their X division, the jewel in TNA's crown. Sure, it would all end in sadness once guys like Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff came in and, as a result, Styles' position became less secure, with this all eventually leading to him leaving the company in 2014 following a contract dispute. But none of this changes the fact that during the time he was there, AJ was a true ace of the company in every respect. And with WWE currently having a working relationship with TNA, there's now the possibility he returns there for a special appearance at some point. One person who won't likely be joining him in doing that in the immediate future though, as a result of them working for AEW, is our next subject, the man, the myth, the legend, Samoa Joe. Now you could argue that in Samoa Joe's early career he was closely linked with 2 separate companies, but while his time in Ring of Honor was legendary, for the purposes of today's video, we want to focus on his run in the Impact Zone instead, as like with AJ Styles, he was there able to serve as a pillar of the promotion and a major reason it ever had any of the success it did. After all, it was him who helped them to reach what many people today still consider to be their creative peak when he had his excellent feud with Kurt Angle in 2005. And it was him who at various points held both the TNA World Championship and the TNA X Division Championship with all the class and legitimacy you would expect from a top guy. And if that wasn't enough, it was also him who helped to keep the whole promotion afloat during some of its weaker periods, like the Aces and Eights storyline. Really, there's not much the Samoan submission machine wasn't able to do down in Nashville. Hell, he even took part in what is still largely considered to be Impact's best match ever when at Unbreakable 2005, he, AJ Styles, and Christopher Daniels had one of the best triple threat bouts ever. And that's only the tip of the iceberg of great matches Joe had during the 2000s and early 2010s. We could fill up an entire video by just running through them all if we really wanted, but we won't do that. Instead, we'll just state that when the book is finally written on TNA, Samoa Joe will undoubtedly serve as one of the faces on its Mount Rushmore, as he was just that important to them. And it was his early success there which allowed to move on to arguably even greater things afterwards, when he became a 3-time NXT World Champion and a 1-time AEW World Champion. That said, he's not the only person who's become all elite after working for TNA, as the same could be said for one of the promotion's founding fathers, Jeff Jarrett. That's right, before he was a part of his current faction in AEW alongside technical wizard Jay Lethal, backstage agent Sanjay Dutt, and giant Satnam Singh, Double J was one of the people directly responsible for TNA forming in the first place. After all, it was after the fall of WCW in 2001 that he and his father Jerry realized that there was going to be a need for somewhere else for wrestlers to work, and that was why they decided to form an all-new company then. Of course, this company would go on to become Total Nonstop Action, and during its early years at least, Jeff Jarrett would serve as one of its top stars, with him becoming a 6-time world champion and 1-time King of the Mountain champion, all while he was also getting a chance to feud with all the big names they had on their roster, some of which we've mentioned already, and others of which we'll get to soon enough. Was it always great for him in Nashville? No. After the Carter family ended up buying a controlling stake of the promotion and Dixie Carter was placed in the position of day-to-day leadership, much of Jarrett's influence started to dissipate, and this would eventually lead to him growing disillusioned with the whole endeavor. But that didn't mean he wasn't still doing great work while he was there, whether it be part of his Planet Jarrett stable, his team-up with Immortal, or just as a solo act. Hell, even when he decided to start stepping away from the ring in 2011, he'd serve a critical role in TNA for a few years yet as a backstage executive, helping to keep all the cogs of the machine turning, even when the company was in dire straits at times. So for that reason alone then, you can't underestimate the importance he's had in Impact still being around today as a viable place where North American wrestlers can earn a living. And this importance can still be seen in the modern day, because it's today that the Impact Zone serves as the workplace for our next subject, Jordynne Grace. Now, if you're not a viewer of current-day TNA but are a viewer of NXT, then you've likely recently been introduced to Jordynne Grace, as it was at the latter brand's Battleground show in June of 2024 that she walked through the prohibited portal to challenge their women's champion Roxanne Perez. And while her performance that night certainly earned her a host of new fans, those who are still tuning into Impact on a weekly basis were already well aware of her talents, as she's been showing them off there since 2018. What has she achieved during her 6-year spell working for TNA? Well, how about the fact she's already become a 3-time Knockouts champion, 1-time Knockouts Tag Team champion, and 1-time Digital Media champion? And if that's not enough, what about the fact she's built up quite a resume for herself by having a series of bangers against the likes of Tessa Blanchard, Deonna Purrazzo, and Tenille Dashwood? Yes, long before she ever showed up on WWE TV, Jordynne Grace was already a superstar in waiting. And with the length of her current contract with Impact being unknown, there's every possibility she still has years left with which to add more accolades to her increasingly large list there. The only question at this point is, will TNA be able to keep her forever, or will, as many people suspect, WWE sign her up once she becomes a free agent? But even if that happens, Impact will have served a key role in her career in allowing her to make a name for herself and prove to others who have a bigger stage exactly what she's capable of. Is this the level the company had once hoped to be on? No, but in the modern day, that's the reality of TNA. That they're a solid number 3, a company who can at the very least serve as a canvas for wrestlers to be creative and find who they are, much in the same way ECW once acted. Not that it was always this way though. No, back in 2005, there was a very brief window where it looked like they might actually be able to compete with the Fed, and the catalyst for this moment was when our next subject signed with them, Kurt Angle. That's right, undeniably the biggest signing Dixie Carter ever made, Kurt Angle was an absolute game changer when he first appeared in the Impact Zone during the mid-2000s. And the reason for this is because, even if his substance abuse issues were already starting to get the better of him by then, he was still arguably the best wrestler in the world. So when fans were suddenly given the opportunity to see him have a classic series against Samoa Joe, or lock horns with other TNA talent like AJ Styles and Christopher Daniels, the anticipation was high. And the Olympic hero certainly didn't disappoint here, as each time he hit the ring, he would give a stellar performance. Sure, he would later go through his notorious Perk Angle phase while under Impact's employ. But even when this was happening, he was still one of the best on the roster and probably the biggest star outside of another person we'll get to in a moment. And that's exactly why he'd become not only a 6-time TNA World Champion, but at one point, famously the man holding all the male titles the promotion had to offer at the same time. Really, while his time in WWE is more iconic to some, you could make the argument that the best run Kurt Angle ever had was in TNA, and that, when all is said and done, it will be this period which defines his career more than anything else. After all, if he'd retired in 2005 and disappeared forever without having that second bite at the apple somewhere else, then it's entirely possible he wouldn't be as well regarded as he is today. But he did, and he is, and so because of that, we have to rank the Pittsburgh native's run in Nashville as one of the best the promotion ever had. So good in fact that he'd remained there all the way up until 2016, at which point his in-ring career was all but over, at least on a full-time level. That said, Kurt Angle isn't the only legend of the Attitude Era who put out some great work while in TNA during the 2000s and 2010s, because the same applies to our next subject, Sting! Now, we know Kurt Angle was a star, But even he'd probably tell you he wasn't as big of a star as Sting, and that's because during the heights of the Monday Night Wars at the turn of the millennium, Steve Borden had been the undisputed face of WCW and one of the biggest names in wrestling overall. So when he decided not to sign on the dotted line with Vince McMahon following World Championship Wrestling's fall, and instead hitch his wagon to the then fledgling TNA brand, it was exactly what they needed to help get themselves established. How would his time in the Impact Zone work out for him? Pretty well, as it happened, because instantly being treated like a superstar and an incoming legend, the Stinger was rocketed straight up to the main event scene, where he'd have notable feuds against the likes of Jeff Jarrett, Kurt Angle, Christian Cage, and more. And as if that wasn't enough, he'd also become a 5-time world champion too. Could he have just played the hits here and took the easy route? Sure, but that was never an option for Steve Borden. So this was why, aside from giving fans what they wanted with more of the Crow Sting, he also branched out into other areas like his Joker Sting incarnation or his heel main event Mafia run. And all that came together then to create a truly iconic run which only further solidified his status as an all-time legend, someone who deserves to be considered among the greats of not just TNA, but also of wrestling in general on account of just how great he was well into his 40s and beyond. No, he might not have been at his peak level of physicality during this time in Nashville, but that didn't mean he wasn't a little older and a little wiser and, as a result, able to do more with less here. But of course, it wasn't all about the men during the glory days of Impact. No, as it's been pointed out before, their women's division back during the mid-2000s and beyond was perhaps the strongest North America had ever seen at that point, with it serving as the true women's revolution in American women's wrestling. And of the people who helped the division reach this level, maybe no one was as important as Gail Kim. Why is that? Well, because it was Gail Kim who, through her matches against Awesome Kong, really first established the Knockouts division as being a place to watch. Something so good it could at points serve as a bigger draw for fans than anything the men were doing. Yes, while WWE was still in the era of bikini contests and Playboy pillow fights, Gail Kim was proving that the ladies could be more. So it should come as little surprise then that during her time working in the Impact Zone, she'd become a 7-time Knockout champion and 1-time Knockouts Tag Team champion. It didn't matter if it was her first run between 2005 and 2008 or her second run from 2011 onwards, Kim was always a pillar of the division there and a reason to tune in each and every week. Of course, the fact she's now retired from the ring means we can't watch her wrestle any new matches today, but that doesn't mean we can't still see her influence, because with her currently working as a backstage agent, her fingerprints are to be found in matches featuring the likes of current-day stars such as Jordynne Grace. And on top of this, they can also be found in our next subject's bout whenever she appears in Impact, an old rival of hers who goes by the name of Mickie James. Sure, some fans might be more familiar with Mickie James from her time in WWE, particularly her Ruthless Aggression era run where she feuded with Trish Stratus, but a large part of her legacy is actually tied up with TNA, as it was there that she spent some of her best years and did some of her best work. Yes, after helping to keep women's wrestling in WWE afloat for a while, Mickie moved over to Nashville where she gave an added boost to their Knockouts division. And it was there we got to see her mix it up with a whole new cast of characters such as Madison Rayne, Angelina Love, Velvet Sky, and of course, Gail Kim. Should it be at all surprising then that over the years she'd become a 5-time Knockouts champion and one of the pillars of the division? No, it shouldn't, as even today, well into her 40s, she's still proving herself to be amongst the best whenever she's returned to TNA to take on the likes of Deonna Purrazzo and Masha Slamovich. Honestly, at this rate, we could see Mickie still going for several years yet, and continuing to add to her trophy cabinet again and again, as when you think of great women's performers who have worked for Impact, she has to be right there among the top of the pile. So highly thought of is she in fact, she even managed to appear at the Royal Rumble while under TNA contract in 2022, pipping Jordynne Grace to the post by a full 2 years. But let's return to the men again for a second, because it's there we find our next subject. Someone who has become so intertwined with the identity of the promotion over the years, it's impossible not to think of him as a great of TNA. Who are we talking about here? Who else but Abyss? Now, some might call him a mixture of Kane and Mankind and write him off for that reason, but for our money, Abyss is so much more than this, as he's a true TNA original, one of the greatest gimmicks they ever came up with, and one which stayed within their borders for his entire in-ring career. And as for Christopher Park, the man behind the gimmick, it all began on June 19, 2002. That was the date of Impact's first ever show, and the date that, under the slightly different gimmick of Justice, he took part in a gauntlet for the gold match to crown a new NWA World's Champion. Of course, Park wouldn't win this one, but he would impress TNA officials so much that they'd invite him back the following year, with him then morphing into his final form, Abyss. And over the decade and a half which followed, Abyss would be a constant presence on TV down in Nashville, whether that be as a monster heel or a lovable, misunderstood babyface. Hell, so big a part of TNA's identity was Abyss that he even gave birth to one of their signature bouts, the Monsters Ball match, a match in which all the contestants are locked up alone in a room without light, food, or water for 24 hours before the bout in order to induce extreme feelings of aggression. And that wouldn't be the only iconic thing the Washington, D.C. native was responsible for in Impact either, as later on in his run, he'd also give us the hugely memorable angle where his brother Joseph Park showed up, with Joseph eventually realizing that he was, in fact, one and the same with the masked monster, and was suffering from some sort of dissociative identity disorder. So to call Abyss anything less than a great of TNA would be disingenuous then, as he's such a big part of their legacy, even more so because he never made the jump to somewhere like WWE despite having numerous opportunities over the years. That said, it wasn't all about singles action in the Impact Zone. No, they also had their fair share of great tag team performers too. And one of the best of these was our next subject, James Storm. That's right, before there was Hangman Adam Page, wrestling's preeminent cowboy was James Storm, and a large part of what made him so popular during his time in TNA over multiple different runs between 2002 and 2023 was his stellar work in their tag team division. It didn't matter if he was part of America's Most Wanted alongside Chris Harris and Gail Kim, or Beer Money Inc. alongside someone else we'll get to in a moment. Storm was always a highlight of duos action down in Nashville. But it wasn't just in the tag team division that he excelled, because, like a true great of his company, the Tennessee native was also able to flourish as a singles wrestler as well whenever he was called upon to do so. And that's how we ended up with a situation where not only would he become a 14-time tag team champion there, but also a one-time King of the Mountain champion and one-time World Heavyweight champion. Yes, there really was very little that James Storm couldn't do in Impact. And with him spending almost the entirety of his career there, it left him with plenty of time to fully establish himself as one of the key players of the brand. Need any evidence of this greatness? How about his time in Ric Flair's Fortune stable, or his matches against the likes of Kurt Angle, Bully Ray, and Mr. Anderson? And those are just the singles bouts, as in his tag team work, he's also had a list of classics against pairings such as the Hardy Boys, LAX, and the Motor City Machine Guns. Honestly, when you really break it down, James Storm is quietly one of the all-time greats of the Impact Zone, something which is evident in his resume. But what of his Beer Money Inc. tag team partner, the man we alluded to a moment ago? Well, he also deserves a spot in today's video, as he's none other than Bobby Roode. Okay, if you only know Bobby Roode as being the glorious guy from WWE who does not much except go 50-50 in the mid-card, then you're missing out, because back when he was in TNA, he was one of the best and most consistent performers the company had. It didn't matter if you put him in singles or tag team action, he was equally as good, and this can be seen in his run at not only as TNA World Champion in 2011, but also his successful pairings with the likes of James Storm and the aforementioned Beer Money Inc., and Petey Williams and Eric Young and Team Canada. Basically, all of this is to say that the Ontario native was one of the MVPs of Impact throughout his entire run there between 2004 and 2016. And that's why, before all was said and done, he'd be an 8-time tag team champion, 1-time King of the Mountain champion, 2-time world champion, and winner of the 2011 Bound for Glory series, TNA's brief attempt at doing a G1 Climax-style tournament during the early to mid-2010s. Even during the few times he wasn't in the title picture, he was still delivering and making himself feel like an important part of the show with a wrestling style that, while never flashy, was always crisp and smooth. Kind of like the way Triple H or Randy Orton were, and this meant his peers were always lining up to get a chance to step inside the ring with him, as they knew that if nothing else, he would give them every opportunity to steal the show right out from under the main event's nose. Sure, he may have never reached the same levels of success in WWE, but TNA will always be considered his real home by fans of his anyway, because it was while he was there that he really hit his peak and really showed the world what level of a star he could be. But that the same could be said about most of the people we've discussed today. And so because of that, they will all go down as the greatest of TNA forevermore from here on in.